Hey, folks, thanks so much for joining us this evening. I know we might still have some folks popping on, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time and go ahead and get us rolling here tonight. So first of all, thanks so much for joining me. I popped a question in the chat if y'all don't mind sharing just a little bit about maybe where you're tuning in from this evening, or maybe it's afternoon or the middle of the day for you. I'd love to hear it. And then also would just love to know what types of programs y'all are applying to. I'm really excited to be here with y'all. So we'll go ahead and get started. I wanted to share just a little bit about me as we get going here. Since I asked you to do that, I figure it's only fair if I do that as well. So my name is Krysta Foster. I use she, her pronouns. I have been working with graduate school and medical school applicants for the last 4 years, but have been working in the higher ed space over the last 11 years, advising students in a number of different capacities. So a lot of that has revolved around student leadership, student government, doing a little bit of academic advising, new student orientation work, but I'm really loving where I'm at right now. The work I get to do on a day-to-day basis allows me to work with amazing students like you, who are moving on to the next chapter, who are excited to be pursuing their goals. This work has been really important to me because when I started college, I was a first-generation college student, so nobody else in my family had gone to school. I had no older siblings or older cousins who were able to provide some of that guidance. And so it's been really fun for me to get to be that mentor, to be that advocate for students as they navigate this process, especially if they're in a similar boat. So if that story resonates with some of y'all, just remember, like, you are not alone. There are lots of resources out there, lots of folks, including myself, who are happy to help you navigate those processes, especially if there's nobody else that you're able to kind of rely on for that. In that time, again, I've worked with hundreds of students on med school applications, grad school applications, and really have found a love for helping folks to craft their story, especially as it relates to personal statements, and really being able to share your stories as we're talking to the application committees throughout the application process. So I'm going to give us a quick agenda here for the evening. So we're going to focus on 3 main things. It's so cool to see all of the different focus areas coming in the chat. So thank you all so much for sharing those. Looks like we've got a lot of folks from a lot of different places and with a lot of different interest areas. So the first thing we're going to talk a little bit about is about selecting graduate school programs. So thinking about what are the things that we should be taking into consideration as we're making those decisions about where to apply and where to attend. Next, we'll talk a little bit about the application timeline. So just thinking through kind of where we're at in the process and where we might be headed down the road. And last but not least, we'll talk a little bit about writing your statement. So in thinking about the personal statement that you'll put together, what are the guidelines for sorting through all of that information? What are the major components of a personal statement for a graduate or PhD program? So we're going to go ahead and start off, as I mentioned, with selecting grad programs. So as we're thinking about the number of schools that we might apply to, right, we really want to keep this manageable. At the most, we're thinking about 10 to 12 schools. More commonly, I would say even less than 10, maybe 6 to 8, especially if we're picking a program that's got a really specific focus where there might not be that many programs in the world that even exist that relate to that area of study. Things that we might take into consideration, right, would be geographic location. So thinking about not just where you want to live, but maybe what types of support systems do you hope to have as you get through a master's or PhD program? Is it really important to you to be close to family and friends? Or are you ready for a really big adventure, right? Do you want to go explore another part of the country or another part of the world that you haven't been to yet? So we do want to take into consideration, right, what feels good to us. All of these options are valid, just definitely worth some self-reflection and thinking about, again, is this the next big adventure and we're trying something new? Or is it important to us to keep those folks that we really care about close by, to have our support system intact as we're headed out on this next journey? The biggest piece that we want to take into consideration as we're selecting programs is really that alignment. And so when we're thinking about program alignment, we're taking into consideration things like program values. So thinking about whether the focus area of these programs aligns with your interests. When they talk about the way that they approach research or the way that they approach their classes, are there things about it that are especially compelling to you, right? Do they have, let's say, for example, a research component that's really focused on serving underserved populations through that research, right? Or if we're looking at business programs, are they aligned with the types of employers that we see ourselves working with after we finish that MBA degree program? So again, we really want to take into consideration what values and systems does the program hold close, and do those align with the values that we have and the goals that we have for ourselves, right? So again, thinking about how many schools we want to apply to, keeping that list manageable, thinking about where we want to be geographically, and then also what's really important to us and how do we see that reflected in the schools that we're planning to apply to. So we've mentioned a couple of these already, but again, program values is something that we'll want to take into consideration. Thinking about maybe sustainability is something that's really important to you, right? We want to think about that. If there are potentially, again, specific educational values that you have that are important to you, maybe it's hands-on experience, or maybe you want to have a certain level of theoretical understanding in the work that you're doing, right? Ensuring that the program website touches on those things. So one of the things that I considered as I was applying to graduate programs back a couple of years ago, almost 10 years ago now, which is wild to think about, was I knew that in higher ed, I wanted to move into this practitioner space, right? I wanted to be actively engaged in coaching students and working with them. And so I really wanted a grad program that was focused on that practitioner experience, right? Somewhere where there were lots of assistantship opportunities that I could take to be able to get that experience. Whereas there were a lot of programs that are maybe more theory-based, right? Folks who are interested in the research piece of student development and the academic environment. And while I think all that stuff is super interesting, I knew that I wanted to be able to apply it, right? So I specifically targeted programs that had that practitioner focus, right? Whereas if I had wanted to do research, I might have taken more time to apply to those programs that were more theory-based. So again, thinking about what is the strategy for pursuing the work that you want to pursue post-graduation, how does that program align with that? Similarly, thinking about your research interests. So if there are specific questions that you have about, again, sustainability, or the ways that different marginalized populations are impacted by access to pharmaceuticals, right? Or if we think about things like how do social determinants of health help to influence, whether folks are more likely to adhere to public health guidelines, right? A lot of my experience has been with students in the sciences. And so as we think about research, those are the types of questions that might come up. For sure, there could be other considerations, right, when it comes to research interests. But essentially, we want to make sure that you are finding faculty that align with your interests, right? So be that in research or be it in their connections. We want to make sure that you're applying to a master's program that really aligns with where you see yourself going, whose faculty align with your goals, either in that they have connections to the industries that you're hoping to enter, or that they're doing the type of research that you also want to be doing, and it's really a space that you can learn and grow and thrive. All right, so moving into this application timeline, you'll see that there are some suggestions about what month or what time frame that this takes place in. I just want you to know that this is really flexible. So if you're like, oh gosh, September has already passed, we're halfway into October, just remember, right, all of these things are adjustable. And so we can always build a timeline based on what it is that you're working with in terms of the time we have left in this year's application cycle. But in general, we're definitely doing that application preparation now, right? It's the fall. We're starting to pull together personal statements. We're putting together those research statements, and we're really starting to get in the weeds on that application prep. We see application submissions start maybe end of October, but more usually mid-November to early December. And sometimes those application deadlines can run all the way through January. Exceptions to that might include those of you who are looking at MBA programs. Those deadlines are often a little bit later in the spring, sometimes even into summer, depending on if the program's doing rolling admission. But by and large, especially for master's and PhD programs, we're looking in that end of October to early January deadline for those applications. If your programs are going to require interviews, we might see those start as early as October or November, but certainly will run well into the spring. More commonly, folks are hearing about those interviews in January, February, and March. Schools will be looking for students to make commitments in April. You'll have the summer to celebrate, potentially move, and then grad school would officially start in the fall of 2025 if you're planning to apply this year. So I provide this as just a little bit of context for what the general timeline looks like. Some of you may have contacts or friends who are applying to different types of graduate and professional school programs, and all the timelines are a little bit different. But quite generally for PhD and master's programs, this is kind of the timeline that we're taking into consideration. So in September and October, we're really wanting to spend some time gathering that list of programs that we're most interested in applying to and contacting schools. So something that I hear from folks a lot is that they actually don't realize that they can reach out to those programs that they're most excited about, to talk to the faculty, to talk to a program director, to get their questions answered and gain a better understanding of the program. Right? Those program chairs, those faculty are there to answer your questions. They want to know that you've done your research when it comes to applying to graduate school. And so it's never a bad idea to send an email, make a phone call, just to set up time to ask some of those specific questions you might have. I also have a lot of students who will go out and visit campuses. So especially if there are 2 or 3 programs that they're exceptionally interested in, making the time to do a campus visit, to talk to faculty who are part of the program or who are doing research that you might be interested in, right, is one, a great way to make sure that that program is a good fit for you, but 2, is a great way for you to gather content and relevant information that you can use in your application package. So again, we're spending this month gathering some information about those schools and starting to narrow down that list of where we plan to apply. Next, we want to make sure that we're securing our letters of recommendation. And so we want to get in touch with our letter writers to confirm that they are ready to write those letters of recommendation. If we're in the early stages of that, remember that we definitely want somebody who is a faculty member in your academic area of interest, right? So if we're applying to public health programs, somebody from an undergraduate course in maybe like health psychology or health communication, potentially even one of your hard science classes, right? Those are things that we're taking into consideration. If we're applying to a language master's, right? Making sure that there is somebody from the faculty who can speak to our academic aptitude when it comes to language. So really, again, aligning our program interests with those letters of recommendation. The other things we want to take into consideration are our other professional connections. So in thinking about our letters of rec, maybe think about folks who have supervised you, PIs from a research lab, or even supervisors from jobs or internships you might have had, especially if we're coming from the workforce. Folks that have served as supervisors for you can be a great person to write your letter of recommendation. And then last but not least, when it comes to our personal statements, this is the month where we really want to start putting together our outlines and first drafts. So thinking about, right, what are the major components of what we want to include so that we're able to get our ideas together. I'm going to ask you all to give me just one quick second. The puppy is crying at the door. I'm just going to go ahead and let her in so she doesn't disturb us for the rest of our time together. Thanks, y'all, for your patience. I don't know if you've ever tried to work at home with animals, but it's always a little bit of an adventure. So as I was saying, especially with our personal statements, right, this is a good time just to start generally outlining our ideas. You don't have to have a firm idea of what it is that you're going to write about yet, but just starting to get your ideas down on paper and remembering that at this stage, there are no bad ideas, right? Your personal statements might start out really messy, but that's okay. right? The most important thing is that we've got everything down on paper and we're able to kind of look at it objectively and start to organize that bigger story behind our personal statements. All right. So once we have gotten that school list, right, we really want to spend some time narrowing down those programs. So as I mentioned earlier, we're looking for 10 to 12 programs at the absolute most. Most likely, we're looking more at 6 to 8. Again, taking into consideration those program values, research interests, the faculty that we're interested in, right, making sure that all of those things are accounted for as we're making our decisions about where to apply. This is going to be the stage where we start to send our letters of recommendation writers, our resume, the drafts of our statement, and maybe even a little bit of guidance on what we're hoping they might talk about within their letters, right? So a lot of folks, again, don't realize that we can actually give a little bit of context to our letter writers to help them better understand what we're hoping they'll talk about. As somebody who writes a lot of letters every year for the students that I work with, I love when they give me a little bit of guidance, right? So for example, in my full-time job during the day, I supervise a lot of student employees, right? And so as they're applying to graduate school programs, typically the things that they'll ask me to talk about will be their ability to take on a leadership role, their ability to collaborate effectively with other people. So for this piece, I really want you to be thinking about what are the skills that you developed while working with those letter writers, and how can you ask them to touch on that in their letter of recommendation, right? So between this guidance, sending our resume and the statement draft so they can see the other pieces of your application, this can help to give them a really conclusive and clear picture about how they can best support you as a candidate and applicant. And then last but not least, with our statements in October and November, we're really getting into the thick of things and we're editing. So again, once we've got those first draft ideas down and we've started to formulate a story, right, this is a great time to meet again with your coach or to chat with friends or mentors to really have other folks start digging into your statement, looking for things like clarity, right? Does it make sense to somebody who doesn't have all of that contextual knowledge that you have about yourself and your story, right? Can they read it on paper and clearly understand what you're trying to illustrate? This is also a good time to have folks start revising for grammar and spelling and detail orientation, right? We want to make sure that when we're turning in that personal statement, not only is it reflective of our story, but it's also reflective of our great writing ability, right? Because the personal statement is one of the only written documents that's this type of essay style that you'll be completing with your application. It also serves as a writing sample. And so we want to make sure that that's as strong as can be for the schools that we're applying to. All right, so then as we head into November and December, we might be following up with our letter writers, sending them some reminders about when those deadlines are. Typically, I always tell folks, like, tell your letter writers that you want them to submit your letter about 2 weeks before you actually want them to submit it. So then you have about 2 more weeks to send those follow-ups, right? Check in with them. Folks get busy. And so it can sometimes be something that, they're like, oh, I'll do it next week. But again, giving them that reminder so that it's about 2 weeks from when you actually need it can be a great way to make sure that it's ready by the time you actually need it in the system. In November and December, we're starting to finalize our edits on those personal statements, right? Especially as we're adapting them for different programs. And then last but not least, we're submitting so that we can enjoy our winter holidays and the new year. So let's go ahead and jump into writing your statement. So the first thing I want to touch on is that there are several types of statements that schools might ask you to write. So the first would be a research or academic statement. This is exactly what it sounds like. Schools want to learn a little bit more about what your research interests are, where your academic passions lie, right? And they really want you to focus on that piece, where it comes from, and typically what faculty from the program you're most interested in working with in research once you're enrolled in that master's or PhD program, right? So here, we're really trying to draw alignment between ourselves and our academic and research interests and the faculty at the institution, and why this institution is the right place for us to continue to explore these interests, why these faculty labs are the places that we want to work to continue this research exploration. Next might be your personal statement. And so this is going to be the statement where usually we're talking a little bit more about how we got to where we're at, right? So thinking through maybe where your initial interest in this type of work came from, certainly thinking about the preparation that you've done to get there, right? So even going beyond just the research that you've done, thinking about, are there leadership roles that you have taken on either in the workplace or at university that have helped you to develop the skills you'll need to succeed in this field, right? So beyond maybe the specific language skills or science skills or public health or writing skills, right? If we're thinking about an MA in literature or writing or creative writing, things like that, right? We want to touch on what are the other durable skills or soft skills, as some folks call them. I like durable skills because I think it speaks a little bit more to the ways that they show up in every work environment that we're in. But this is a great place for us to share a little bit more about our story, about where the interest came from and how we've continued to develop that both personally and professionally. And then schools might ask for a statement of purpose. And a statement of purpose is typically a blend of these two types of statements. So typically with this list, you might see schools ask for both a research statement and a personal statement, or you'll see them ask for a statement of purpose. And a statement of purpose is sort of the integration of all of the things we've talked about already, right? This is a document that's going to give the committee a really conclusive picture of who you are academically, but also what about your personal and professional life has really driven you to this place, right? So it kind of takes all of the components of those other two statements and wraps them into one. So one thing that we'll want to be sure of is that as you're getting ready to write those statements, that you've got a really clear understanding. Most of the schools are good about providing like a short blurb or some bullet points about what they're hoping you'll answer. They might even provide a specific question or prompt for you to answer. So we'll always make sure that we're adhering to that as we're starting to put our essays together. So in general, for all of these statements, I want to touch on a couple of do's and don'ts. So the first is that we do want to answer the question from the prompt. So as I mentioned, many of the schools may ask a specific question, may ask you to frame things in a specific way. And so we want to make sure that we're really sticking to that, right? To give them the context that they need in the context that they're asking for it, right? I think especially when it comes to personal statements, we might have some ideas about what we want to share. And certainly we can try to weave in some of those personal elements or some of those personal storytelling strategies. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we are clearly articulating our answer to the prompt for the committee. To do that, we want to make meaning of our experiences, right? I want you to tell a story. I want you to be really specific, right? If you tell me that you went abroad to Paris and it was a great way for you to immerse yourself in French culture, that's good, right? But what's better is if you're able to tell me a story of how you saw the work that you were doing in school come to life, right? Or if we're in a science program, right? I want you to say more than I did research in a lab and it helped me to understand the scientific process, right? I want you to be able to explain to me what are the skills that you gained from that, right? Tell me a story about a time that you failed in the lab and you had to learn from that and move on and help your PI to, coach the team on a new lab strategy, right? So really think about what are those experiences that have helped you to form your expertise, to form your curiosities, and how can we share those with the committee? I want to make sure that as you're thinking about your personal statement that you're getting multiple opinions, right? So again, a coach here on Leland, or even a close friend or faculty mentor, a supervisor, folks that you really trust are all great folks to go to get those multiple opinions, to again ensure that we're communicating our questions or communicating our answers rather in a clear and detailed way. But I also want to make sure that we're maintaining your voice, right? At the end of the day, this is your personal statement or your statement of purpose or your research statement, and it has to sound like you, right? Especially as we think about whether or not programs will have interviews, we want to make sure that the person that they're reading about in that statement matches the person that they see in front of them during that interview. Your personal statement is also a great place to address any discrepancies in your application. And so this is something that you can always talk through again with a coach, with a mentor. But I often see a lot of folks who maybe struggled a certain semester during their college career, right? Maybe you had some personal stressors that you were dealing with, right? Especially over the last 4 or 5 years, none of us are strangers to those, given everything that's gone on in the world. And so if you need a space to kind of talk a little bit about maybe why your grades dipped or why you had to step away from work and take some leave, right? Like, let's use your personal statement to tell that story and talk about how you overcame that challenge and how it's made you more resilient. So again, personal statement can be a great place to talk about those things. Last but not least, as I mentioned earlier, your personal statement is not only a place to share your stories, it's also a chance to be a writing statement, right? It's a chance to demonstrate your writing skills to the committee. And so we want to make sure that we are always writing well and proofreading that statement multiple times, getting multiple sets of eyes on it. A couple of major don'ts. So we don't want to speak in cliches or generalities, right? So especially in the science space, something that I see folks talk about is I like science and I want to help people, right? And you're like, that's great. I am glad that if you're going into cancer research, you like science and you want to help people. It's a good place to start, but I need something a little bit more specific, right? Similarly, if you say, I've always been interested in learning more about other countries, right? And that's why I want to go into international relations. That's a great place to start, but we want to be a little bit more nuanced than that, right? We want to share a unique perspective. The idea behind your personal statement, statement of purpose, academic statement, right, is that it's specific to you and that nobody else should be able to turn that in and have it be completely true, right? So again, wanting to add your nuanced perspective, not sticking to those cliches or generalities. While we talked about addressing discrepancies in your application, I also never want you to feel pressured to talk about traumatic events if you don't feel ready, right? So especially as we think about the things that motivate us to pursue work, right? Oftentimes those can come from deficits or negative experiences we had, right? I shared a little bit in the beginning about how being a first generation college student and having to struggle through that first year of college, especially, right, inspired me to want to go in and work with other students who might be facing those same challenges, right? You might have a similar story, right, about a time that you really struggled or saw somebody struggle. And so you want to help to solve some of those problems, right? But if they're related to a traumatic event for you, be it a personal health challenge, something that you witnessed or experienced, I want you to know that you can get into a master's or PhD program without talking about those things, or at least not talking about them super in depth. This doesn't have to be like a tell-all. It's not the most dramatic story wins. And so I just want you to take into consideration that, yes, we want to be authentic, but you also shouldn't feel like you have to exploit your trauma to get into that program. And then last but not least, we want to make sure that we're not repeating information from our resume. And to be clear, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't talk about anything that is on your resume. You absolutely should talk about those things because they're your lived experience. But instead, I want you to tell stories about them, right? So as I mentioned earlier, stories are our most compelling angle for being able to share our skill set, being able to share our values with the committee. And so we want to take into consideration, right, how our resume might be a little bit more listy. It might include the tasks that we completed as part of a role, right? And so your personal statement should really go beyond that and should really highlight stories that have been a meaningful part of your experience. So as we think about the logistics of the statement, ultimately this boils down to three main things. I want you to be thinking about your motivation. So what initially inspired you to pursue this path, but then how has your motivation grown and matured over time, right? So instead of just talking about how you've always had an interest in archaeology because you really loved dinosaurs as a kiddo, right? Great start to the story, but we want to make sure that that motivation has grown and matured. We want to show the committee how that's happened, right? Those are the stories we're really interested in. Next, we're thinking about our fit and capacity. So again, demonstrating how your skills and your values align with the profession and thinking about the experiences you've had that have prepared you for this work, right? So again, drilling into those specific stories that demonstrate our skills and values. And then last but not least, we want to think about the vision, right? So what values or skills will you use in your work in this field, in your research, in your practical application, in your teaching strategy, and then thinking about the impact that you want to make, right? It's really important that, especially as we head into these programs, that we remain purpose-driven, right? Remembering what got us here and the type of impact that we want to make on the world that we're going into. So real quickly, I want to touch on a couple of basics of essays, right? I think sometimes, especially if we've been out of school for a while, it can be helpful to go through a quick refresher on the type of structure that we're looking for. So typically a standard essay for any of these types of statements is going to include these three major components. So the first is going to be that introduction. We're going to have a couple of body paragraphs where we're going to tell some of those stories that demonstrate our skills and values, and then we're going to wrap everything together, right? Ideally, each paragraph will have a specific topic or theme that will connect to the overall thesis, right, or the overall theme of the paper. So in that introduction, typically what we're looking for is an anecdote or story about how you became interested in science or language or international relations, right? Like whatever that topic area is, we want to share a story about where that interest came from, right? And a little bit about how it continued to develop. And then we want to introduce your thesis, right? Which is essentially that sentence at the end of your intro that says, in this essay, I will talk about, without saying, in this essay, I will talk about, right? But this is where you're going to sort of allude to the skills, the values, the major themes that you're going to be touching on within your body paragraphs. So for those body paragraphs, ideally, we're looking to have about 2 to 3 of those. We'll introduce the skill or theme that you're planning to talk about with this. You would tell a story about how you learned this skill or embodied this value, right? So again, providing really specific context and details about where that comes from, and then summarize how you would use that skill or value in the work that you would be doing, right? Be it in research, be it in teaching, be it in the professional world, right? Various industries that you might be interested in working in. Again, we want to make meaning of those experiences and translate for the committee how those skills are valuable in the program of study that we intend to pursue. Something that I see really often with applicants or even with job applicants, right, is that they struggle to articulate how their skills can be valuable in a new role, at a new school, in a new research lab, on a new teaching team, right? And remember that if you can't draw that translation, the committee can't do it for you, right? And so the most compelling argument we can give them is to say, here's an example of a time that I demonstrated this value, this skill. Here's a time where I really recognize this theme in the work that I do. And here's how I would use that in the program, in the professional world moving forward. And then last but not least, we'll have our conclusion. So this is where we might reiterate our thesis statement and also talk about our long-term vision and goals, and specifically pull in how those align with the program that we're applying to, right? So this is where we can get really specific about the school that we're sending the application into. And right throughout the essay, we want to make sure that we're sort of reiterating, right, why this program, why this faculty member, always circling back to make that argument really specific to the institution that we're applying to. So as you think about preparing your statement, we might reflect on a number of different experiences. So we might think about volunteer work, research that we've done, personal connections to the topic, or even leadership roles we've taken on, be that in student organizations or in the professional world. So again, sometimes making a list of all of the things we've done can be a really helpful way to start brainstorming for our personal statement. Typically, I'll encourage applicants to make like a T chart. And on one side, we just do a brain dump of all the things you've done, right? Places you volunteered, research you've done, personal factors that have driven you towards this work, jobs that you've had, internships, shadowing, study abroad, whatever it is, right? And then on the other side, we start to think about, okay, what are the things that we learned from this experience in relation to where we're headed, right? And so then the story kind of starts to take shape from there as we can see like what those common themes are. So again, a great way to start brainstorming, just put everything down on paper, give yourself a chance to just start to see how those dots are connected. All right, so just a couple of final bits of advice before we have a couple minutes for questions here. So I want you to limit your time reading other people's personal statements, right? I know it can be hard to come up with a statement if you're not quite sure what you're looking for, but Leland Plus has a lot of really great samples if you do want to look at a few just to get an idea of what the structure looks like. But ultimately, your personal statement has to be yours, right? And not that I think that you would copy or plagiarize, but I also don't want you to get in your head about, well, this isn't exactly what this other person did, right? That's okay. There are thousands of other applicants who didn't do exactly what this person did and also got in, right? So I want you to just trust your gut and tell your story in a way that feels authentic to you. Don't overthink your first draft. Your first draft is not going to be perfect. It's not even going to be the final copy that you turn in, right? It's probably not even going to be close. The most important thing is that we just start getting ideas down on paper so that we can start to sort through them. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be done. Give yourself time, right? Give yourself, if you know that you work best in short bursts, right? Maybe give yourself 3 30-minute sessions over the course of a week to work on your personal statement, right? And use that to be your initial brainstorming time. Likewise, right, if you know that you work better in longer sessions, maybe you give yourself a full 2 to 4 hours, depending on what your needs are, right? What you know about yourself and your productivity style, to make sure you're leaning into that. Again, I want you to maintain your voice and really highlight your unique point of view. Again, these committees are looking at you. They're not looking at the people around you for whether or not you're going to get into that graduate or professional school program. So I do have a code here on the screen that y'all can use for $50 off your first order with me. Again, I've been coaching here on Leland for just a couple of months, but have been working with folks over the last 4 years and would be happy to support you in your grad school journey. You can also use the QR code here on the screen to set up a free intro call. So I'll go ahead and leave that up as we're getting wrapped up here this evening, but I'm happy to go ahead and take any questions. So if folks want to pop those in the chat or go ahead and unmute, we've got like 10-ish minutes to work through questions that y'all might have. All right, so we have a question in the chat about submitting your GRE score, even if it's not required. So I would say that if your GRE score is competitive, it can't hurt. Something that we might especially take into consideration as we're thinking about this would be your GPA from any other schools that you've attended, right? So if your undergraduate GPA was maybe a little bit lower than you would have liked it to be, being able to show that academic aptitude by submitting a strong GRE score can be super helpful. So I'd say this is really dependent on your situation. But in general, if it's a strong score and it's going to boost the committee's understanding of your academic aptitude, I say go ahead and submit it. But if you're like, I'm not super thrilled about the way that this went, I'm not a standardized testing person, totally feel that, then don't worry about submitting it now. Karina, good. I'm glad to hear that this was helpful. So when in this process, so should I start looking for scholarships? So each school and honestly, each scholarship program has different approaches to this. I would say you could start looking for scholarships now, but I would also keep looking all the way throughout your program, right? So there are schools who will have scholarship applications that are specifically open just for incoming students. And I would contact their admissions team about that, ask if there are program specific scholarships, spend a little bit of time on their website, right? Especially for things like identity-based scholarships. So again, I think it's never too early, but I want to make sure that you're staying consistent with that too, right? When it comes to applying for scholarships. So start now, even while you're applying to those schools, but continue throughout your time there as well, as oftentimes there are additional scholarship opportunities available for current students. When should I apply for the FAFSA? That is a great question. And I'm going to be 100% honest with you. I don't have a clear timeline on the FAFSA right now. I know that the system has changed in recent years, and I don't typically work with students on that piece. That being said, if we end up working together in coaching, I promise I will get you a solid answer. But at this point in time, I would have you check the FAFSA website, which is fafsa.ed.gov, to get the most up-to-date information about when the FAFSA opens and for which award year that is. So really make sure that you're paying attention to when the deadlines are for the award year that you would be starting school. Okay, next question. I'm an economics major with a minor in data science. Okay, so you're an economics major with a minor in data science. I'm applying for data science masters. Would not bringing a data science major affect my admissions? Also, I haven't had many data science experiences. What should I be aware of slash do when addressing this in my application? So the first thing I would do is, as I mentioned earlier, reaching out to the programs ahead of time can be a great way for us to gather information that's specific to those programs, right? So um, many programs will typically accept students with a number of different undergraduate majors, right? It's very rare for folks to pursue exactly the same thing in graduate school as they did in their undergrad. So I personally don't see a problem with it. That being said, I would check with the school, especially as we're thinking about prerequisites, right? We want to make sure that we've hit all of those prereqs coming into graduate school. So, right, if we're going into a data science master's program, making sure that the classes that we took in econ and data science in our undergrad have helped to prepare us for that, and just taking note of if there are additional classes that we need to take in order to fill those prerequisite requirements. So, in summary, reach out to the programs that you're specifically interested in, and definitely just make sure that we're hitting those prereqs. I think overall, it's not something that we need to address in your application specifically in terms of why you are shifting your focus a little bit. We'll just talk about why you have that specific interest in data science, right? Maybe some of the experiences that have led you there. But more logistically, I would just make sure that you've hit your prereqs required for the program. All right, question. If you're coming from the workforce and looking to make a career pivot, how would you go about discussing work experience? Yeah, so I think about this in the context of the profession that you're going into, right? And really highlighting those transferable skills. So let's say maybe we're making the jump from business to something that's more creative, right? Maybe we're highlighting our ability to manage projects or to collaborate with others, right? Really thinking about what those transferable skills are that we're bringing to the profession. Again, I think going in and making that T chart that I talked about earlier can be a great way for us to just kind of do a refresher and a reset on what experiences we're bringing to the table, and looking at that meaning making column, right, to think about how they align with the values of the profession and of the schools that we're applying to. So again, we'll be incredibly specific depending on what that pivot looks like. But think about what are the skills you have that you know will translate to the new focus area. What if you have more volunteering experience than work experience? That's totally okay, right? We have lots of different reasons for the types of opportunities we pursue leading up to graduate studies. And so the most important thing here is that you're able to make meaning of those experiences and describe them in a way that makes sense to the committee in relation to your program of study, right? So it doesn't matter if you didn't get paid for it. The biggest thing, right, is that you've made meaning of that experience, right? That you are able to pull out what are the skills that I developed as a result of this volunteer experience, and how they have they prepared me for this master's or PhD work. I think I missed a couple of questions up here. If my schools have an optional essay of talking about discrepancies in my application, but I don't have many major ones, should I just not do the essay? Absolutely. Don't write anything that you don't need to write, one, right? And then two, we want to make sure that the committee is focused on what we do want them to read. And so I would say, yes, you could go ahead and bypass that essay if there's not much for you to talk about. For those who are taking gap year, what is your advice to become a strong candidate, and how to balance working on several applications at once? Great question. So I would say that in your gap year, right, continue to pursue opportunities that are going to serve you in your application process, right? Take a job or take on a volunteer experience or research that's going to relate to the work that you'd be doing in your master's or PhD program. Right, so that we have more content to talk about in your application. When it comes to balancing your applications, I would say, right, creating an Excel sheet that's got all of the schools and their deadlines and their contact information is super important. And typically what I advocate for is starting with the school that you're most excited about in the beginning, right? And writing your statement for that school, and then going back and tailoring it to the others, right? By picking that first one, I think, right, like we can really get excited about the process. We're really engaged, we're really creative. And then as the process goes on, right, like we've got a solid place to start from for those others. So the personal statements are likely going to overlap for most of the schools that you're applying to, especially if the master's or PhD programs are in a really niche area of study. So I would pick one school, start there, and then adapt your personal statement or statement of purpose from there. All right, another question. Would you typically ask the same recommenders to write a letter to all of the programs you're applying to? For example, I'm applying to 6, but I have all my recommenders send a letter to all of them. Would this be too much to ask of them? So typically, same sort of thing with the personal statements, right? Is that um, you're going to probably be applying to schools that are really similar, programs that are really similar. So typically your letter writers should only need to change a couple of small details, right? Probably just the program name. You could also have them write it really generally, right? To just say that they're recommending you for, the program of study that you're applying to. And again, if that name is the same for all of your programs, that should be a pretty low commitment. So absolutely, all of that to say, you can use the same letter for multiple institutions. And actually, I would advocate for that, right? The chances that you have 12 to 18 strong contacts, right, for 2 to 3 letter writers for each school. That's tough, right? It's tough to have that many super meaningful relationships with folks that would write you a letter of recommendation. So no, I would absolutely reuse those, have them keep them general enough that they're specific to your program of study, but that they're maybe not specific to a program unless they're willing to go in and like change the name of the school each time. What are some writing tips to make sure your personal statement or certain paragraphs are not vague? Again, that story piece, right? If we can tell a story, that's really specific, right? It's giving us a specific experience that we're really sorting through to be able to demonstrate a skill set for the committee. So again, if we can stick to those stories and those narratives, that's a great way to make sure that our personal statement is never vague, for sure. Okay, great. This has been a great list of questions. I'm so glad that I got the chance to be here with y'all this morning, or this evening, rather. It's been a long day. So, again, I've got this QR code. If y'all want to set up a free intro call, we can absolutely talk more. I'll also go ahead and grab the link to my Leland page in case folks just want to head right over there after the session is over, if you don't have your phone handy. So let me go ahead and get y'all that link. And we can make sure that we get you off and on your way this evening or afternoon, whatever it is for you. So I've dropped the link in the chat. Thank you all so much for being here. It looks like maybe if there are folks who still have questions, I'm happy to stay behind for a couple more minutes. But otherwise, it's been great to chat with all of you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. You're so welcome. Thanks for having me. Thanks for joining.